The CNBC is out this morning with its annual list of NHL valuations. The average NHL team now worth $2.2 billion.
Most people who want to buy an NHL franchise walk in with proof that the money exists. John Spano walked in with forged bank letters and a trust that nobody bothered to verify, and the league approved him unanimously. He owed $17 million on a single installment, wired $1,700 instead, and for weeks, the people in charge said nothing. The New York Islanders won 4 consecutive Stanley Cups between 1980 and 1983. And for a few years after that, no franchise in professional hockey carried more weight. By the mid-1990s, that version of the team was so far gone, it might as well have belonged to a different sport. Nassau Coliseum was falling apart, the roster was bleeding talent because ownership refused to spend, and the relocation rumors had already started circling in the way they always do when a franchise stops pretending it has a future. Atlanta, Nashville, Houston. The names changed depending on who you asked, but the message stayed the same. The Islanders were leaving Long Island until somebody showed up with real money and a reason to stay. The owner at the center of all this was John Pickett, who had held the team since the late 1970s and had spent most of the last decade treating it like something he forgot he owned. He had moved to Florida, handed operations off to a group of minority stakeholders who couldn't keep the front office from collapsing in on itself, and kept cashing the checks from the team's cable television contract with Sports Channel New York, which was pulling in roughly $13 million a year. That cable deal was the only part of the franchise generating consistent revenue, and Pickett was pocketing it instead of putting it back into the team. The Islanders had missed the playoffs in 5 of the previous 8 seasons. The arena was half empty on most nights, and Pickett wasn't just open to selling, he needed to sell, because the alternative was watching the franchise rot from the inside until someone moved it to a city where the stands would actually fill. A league carrying a distressed franchise inside a distressed market is not a league that's going to ask hard questions about the person offering to fix it. The NHL needed someone to buy the Islanders and keep them on Long Island, and that need shaped every decision that followed. When a buyer finally appeared, the incentive was not to interrogate him. The incentive was to believe him. The buyer was John Spano, and on paper, he looked like exactly the kind of person the league had been waiting for. He was 32 years old, based in Dallas, the president of a company called the Bison Group, and he claimed a personal net worth of $230 million, most of which he attributed to an inheritance from his wealthy grandfather, Angelo, including a purported $107 million trust administered by a Dallas attorney. He had already tried to buy into the NHL twice before. First with a bid for half the Dallas Stars in 1995, and then a run at the Florida Panthers in 1996. And both deals had fallen apart without closing. But those failures didn't raise red flags. If anything, they made him look more credible, because the league already knew his name, and familiarity in professional sports ownership circles tends to function as its own kind of due diligence. Nobody asked why the first 2 deals collapsed. They just noticed he kept coming back. In October 1996, Spano agreed to buy the Islanders from John Pickett for $165 million. The deal was structured in 2 parts, and the structure itself is where the fraud lived. $80 million would go toward Pickett's 90% stake in the franchise, financed by a loan from a syndicate of banks led by Fleet Bank out of Boston. The remaining $85 million would cover the Sports Channel cable television rights, paid to Pickett in installments over 5 years. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward acquisition. Underneath it, the entire thing was held together by 3 letters and a system that assumed someone else had already done the checking. The first letter came from Joseph Lynch, a senior vice president at the Dallas Bank of Comerica branch, certifying that Spano maintained a net worth in excess of $100 million. Lynch would later tell federal prosecutors that the figure in his letter was based entirely on financial statements that Spano himself had provided, and that he had never independently verified any of them. The second letter came from a man named Clive Jones at Lloyds Bank in London, confirming the existence of the $107 million trust. When investigators eventually contacted Lloyds Bank, a spokesman told Newsday that no employee by the name of Clive Jones existed at the institution. The third letter came from T. McCullough Strother, a Dallas attorney Spano had retained to serve as trustee of the supposed inheritance. Strother would later tell prosecutors he had been unable to verify the trust's existence because Spano kept refusing to document the funds. On the strength of those three letters, Fleet Bank approved an $80 million loan. The bank leaned on the Comerica letter. The league leaned on the bank. Pickett leaned on the league. Every institution in the chain assumed that a different institution had already verified the money, and not one of them had. The NHL's own vetting process for the man about to take control of a franchise it had spent years trying to save consisted of hiring a former FBI agent to run a background check that cost somewhere between $500 and $750. Most professional sports leagues at the time were spending upwards of $30,000 to evaluate prospective owners. The NHL spent less than the price of a decent television set. The Board of Governors approved the sale unanimously in February 1997.
The NHL did do some final paperwork Monday and approved the sale, finally, of the New York Islanders to John Spano. He's a 32-year-old Dallas businessman who paid $164 million for the Islanders hockey team.
Gary Bettman, the league's commissioner, would describe Spano in an April interview as the type of person we want as an owner. Pickett believed he had finally found his exits. The fans on Long Island believed the franchise had been saved. And John Spano, who did not have the money, who never had the money, who had built the entire acquisition on forged letterhead and 3 phone calls nobody bothered to make, walked into an NHL franchise with an $80 million loan he had no way of repaying and an $85 million cable obligation he had no intention of honoring. Spano took operational control of the Islanders in April 1997, and for a few weeks, he did everything a new owner is supposed to do. He forced Mike Milbury to give up the head coaching position and hand it to Rick Bowness, while Milbury stayed on as general manager. He pumped $2.5 million into the team's payroll. He talked publicly about chasing major free agents that summer, about turning the Islanders into contenders again, about renovating or replacing Nassau Coliseum. The fan base, starved for any sign that someone in charge actually cared, treated him like a savior. He was flying back and forth from Dallas on what he said was his private jet, holding court in the owner's box, asking longtime fans for advice on how to run the team. One of them later described him as someone who had been given a new toy and was having the time of his life with it. Then the first cable installment came due. The payment was $16.5 million, owed to Pickett on April 7th, and the money wasn't there. Spano told Pickett it would be wired out shortly and showed him a letter from Lloyds Bank in London promising the transfer. Pickett, who had spent years trying to get out from under this franchise and could finally see the end of it, took Spano at his word and closed the deal anyway. What followed over the next 2 months was a cascade of failed payments so bizarre that if you listed the excuses without context, they'd read like the plot of a comedy no one would believe. Spano wired $5,000 against a $5 million obligation. A $17 million check bounced. A wire transfer meant to cover the bounced check arrived at $1,700 because apparently the decimal point had slipped. According to Pickett's furious letter to Commissioner Bettman, which cataloged the entire litany, Spano blamed funds shielded from taxes in the Cayman Islands for one delay, an IRA bomb threat in the London Underground for another, a fire at the office from which the funds were supposed to be sent for a third, his wife's chemotherapy treatments for a fourth, and at one point, he invoked mobsters. After 5 separate attempts to pay the cable installment, Pickett had received a grand total of $26,200 out of $85 million owed. The systemic failure cuts deeper than the fraud itself, because the league knew. Pickett's letter to Bettman laid out all of this in June 1997, and the response was not to immediately investigate whether the man running one of their franchises was a con artist. The response was to ask Spano to step away from day-to-day operations and wait for the dispute to be settled. The institution did not catch the fraud. The fraud was handed to the institution in writing by the victim, and the institution still hesitated. When the NHL's Board of Governors met in June, Spano wasn't even present. The Islanders were represented by two men from the old Pickett regime, and the league treated this as a contractual disagreement rather than what it actually was, which was a man who had never had the money sitting in the owner's chair of a professional hockey team while the previous owner begged someone to do something about it. It took a newsroom to do what an entire league could not. In early July, Newsday reporters, acting on tips from anonymous Islanders executives who had started to suspect their new boss was not what he claimed to be, began digging into John Spanos' background. On July 9th, they published what they found, and the gap between who Spano had claimed to be and who he actually was made the whole thing look a lot less like a con and more like a dare. He was worth roughly $5 million, not $230 million. The Bison Group, which he had described as a worldwide empire of 10 companies and more than 6,000 employees, had 22 employees and $3 million in assets, all operating out of a single office in Dallas. The inherited fortune from his wealthy grandfather didn't exist. Neither of his grandfathers had left an estate valued at more than $246,000. His $2.5 million home in the University Park section of Dallas, which he had claimed to own free and clear, carried a mortgage and $85,000 in unpaid property taxes. And when he finally wrote a check to cover those back taxes, that check bounced too. 2 days after the Newsday story broke, on July 11th, Bettman brokered a mediation in which Spano agreed to relinquish control of the Islanders back to Pickett, with Pickett agreeing in return not to sue for breach of contract. On July 21st, federal authorities showed up at Spano's home and office in Dallas with a warrant for his arrest. But he wasn't there. He was in the Cayman Islands. For a brief moment, it looked like the sports world might have produced its own version of a fugitive financier, but Spano surrendered on Long Island 2 days later. And on July 23rd, he was arraigned on federal charges of bank fraud, wire fraud, and forgery. The investigation that followed confirmed what the Newsday reporting had already made obvious. The Comerica letter certifying Spanos' net worth had been based on documents Spano himself had supplied, none of which Lynch had verified. The Lloyd's Bank letter had been forged entirely. A June 8th letter on Comerica stationery claiming Spano had the funds to cover his bounced $17 million check was traced back to a fax machine at the Bison Group office, and the executive whose signature appeared on it denied ever writing it. An altered fax from Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenrette claiming Spano owed $27 billion in treasury bills carried fax machine markings that were an exact match to the Bison Group machine as well. The Fleet Bank loan officer who had approved the $80 million deal was forced to resign. Spano pleaded guilty. On January 28, 2000, he was sentenced to 71 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $11.9 million in restitution to his victims, including the Islanders, 2 Dallas businesses, and $1.25 million to Mario Lemieux. The league responded to the humiliation by tightening its vetting process, bringing in a New York law firm to evaluate prospective owners going forward. And then it happened again. John Regas bought the Buffalo Sabres in 1997, and the league took over the franchise after his arrest for fraud in 2002. William Boots Del Biagio purchased a stake in the Nashville Predators in 2007 using $110 million in fraudulently obtained loans, and he was sentenced to 8 years. The failure was not a fluke. It was structural. As for the Islanders, Pickett sold the team to Howard Milstein and Steve Gluckstern in 1998, and they proceeded to gut the payroll, chasing profits that never materialized. Milstein and Gluckstern sold to Charles Wong in 2000, and Wong became the owner who actually stabilized the franchise. But that stability came years after a fan base had been sold a savior, had cheered for him, had believed the losing was finally over, and had watched the whole thing turn out to be a performance by a man who never had the money to be in the room. John Spano got out of prison in June 2004. By 2005, he was running a loan-free scam that got him 51 months. After that, he took a job as a driver at a healthcare laundry company in suburban Cleveland, got promoted to sales, and started forging invoices for commissions on accounts that didn't exist. 10 more years in Ohio. Released November 2024. The NHL was not outfoxed by a criminal mastermind. It was fooled by a serial small-timer with a fax machine and good letterhead. If he could walk into the room, the door was never locked. The Healthy Scratch membership is how you support more stories like this one. Link is below. You get early access to every video and a free ebook. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the next one is coming soon.